Hello Biology 100 students, welcome to your lecture on the integumentary system. The integumentary system includes skin and all the accessory structures such as hair and also sebaceous glands. Okay, there's a lot of different functions of skin. First, we talk about thermoregulation, right? It helps us to dissipate excess body heat, and it does that in two different ways. Firstly, we have perspiration, right? When we overheat, we perspire, we sweat, and that sweat evaporates and carries heat away in that manner. The other thing that the skin does is that as we overheat, our blood vessels in the skin will dilate, bringing the blood closer to the surface of the skin so we can just have cooling that way as well. Now, speaking of blood, the skin is an excellent blood reservoir. We have lots of big veins within our skin that are holding on to blood, and then they can contract reflexively and force that blood back into circulation if it's needed. Also, the skin is an excellent protective barrier. It's our first barrier between everything on the outside and everything that's so delicate on the inside. So we have lots and lots of cells on the top of our skin in our epithelium, and they're held together with tight junctions. There's a fibrous keratin protein in there, and it's pretty impenetrable to things like bacteria and stuff unless we have a break in the skin. We have lipids in the skin that make it fairly waterproof, and we also have pigment in there with our melanocytes, which help to prevent too much UV radiation from getting to the lower layers. And finally, we also have immune cells called Langerhans cells that are there to grab a hold of suspected pathogens and present those to our immune system for identification. Okay, other functions of skin, of course, include sensation. Your skin is your largest sensory organ, right? You can feel on your skin all throughout your body. You have very fine touch discrimination on your fingertips, not so fine elsewhere like on the back of your neck, but suffice it to say we have sensory receptors all throughout our skin, and if you've ever gotten a paper cut, you know how painful the skin can be if it's cut. It's also important for metabolism. So we said before that we have these pigment cells called melanocytes. Well, we do need a little bit of UV radiation in order to synthesize the active form of vitamin D. And so that's one of the functions of skin, is harnessing UV radiation to make vitamin D. And finally, the skin is actually an excretory organ as well. Most of the time you think of the urinary system as excretory or even the digestive system, but the skin actually passes about 400 mils of water and solutes through every day. And the solutes here include things like sodium and chloride ions, hydrogen ions, but it also includes a little bit of urea. So next time you're at the gym and somebody gets off the machine and it's all sweaty and they haven't wiped it down, just remember it's kind of like there's a little bit of pee in that sweat. Okay, so the integumentary system, the skin consists of three main layers. We have an epidermis, a dermis, and a hypodermis. Now, technically, you'll look at your textbook and say, Dr. Langston, the hypodermis is not really part of the skin. Well, that's true, but we always include it in the chapter on the skin because there's nowhere else to include it. So we'll just call it part of the skin and be okay with it. Okay, so first we're going to look at the epidermis. Remember, epi means on top, and the epidermis is the very top layer of skin right here going from here to here. Okay, the epidermis is composed of stratified squamous epithelium, or stratified squamous if you like. And remember, stratified here meant that it was made up of several layers, and squamous meant that the layer on top was very flattened. And so you can see here, this is all stratified squamous epithelium going from here to here. Probably at least 30 different layers of cells, and up here the cells are even dead. So that's important. It's a very big impenetrable layer. Now, the other thing about the epidermis and epithelium in general is it's avascular, meaning it does not have a blood supply. All the blood, all the nutrients are coming from down here in the connective tissue, and that has to diffuse up to the topmost cells. And so as you can imagine, if you're the topmost cells, you're probably getting less nutrients than the cells that are down here. As a result, these cells are actually dead, and we'll talk about why in just a little bit. But suffice it to say, the epidermis is made up of lots and lots and lots of layers of cells. Okay, so the cells of the epidermis include four main types. First of all, the majority of cells are keratinocytes, and they are the cells that produce keratin. Keratin is a tough, waterproof, fibrous protein which we find in our fingernails and also in our hair, but of course it's found in the skin as well. And it makes this tough, waterproof barrier. Next up, we have the cells called melanocytes. Now, melanocytes produce melanin, which help to protect the underlying tissues from too much UV radiation. And then we have tactile or Merkel cells, which are sensory receptors, right? Your skin is an excellent sensory organ. And finally, we have these Langerhans cells or dendritic cells, and they're the ones that are grabbing a hold of would-be pathogenic material and presenting them to our immune system for identification and possible destruction. Okay, so here you can see a melanocyte right here. So the melanocytes are located within the epithelial layer in the epidermis, and they have these sort of extensions right here. And when we get exposed to a lot of UV radiation, the pigment will spread out, and as a result, our skin will darken or tan. But the purpose of the melanocyte is not so we look bronzed and stuff like that. It's to really protect the underlying tissues from UV radiation, because UV radiation is a known carcinogen and known mutagen. It can really destroy the DNA very, very quickly if we don't have protection. Okay, speaking of color and pigmentation, we said that melanocytes are responsible for the skin color that we see, but there's also other colors we see in the skin that can be diagnostic and used for detecting disease and things like that. So first of all, we'll start out on this side. Up here you can see what we call cyanosis. And cyan, remember, means blue. So cyanosis is something we don't like to see in the skin. If we see it here in the fingertips, it usually means one of two things. Very bad circulation, which that could be a cause, or we could have hypoxia. For whatever reason, that person's not getting enough oxygen, or they're ischemic, but something's causing the tissue in here not to get enough blood, not to be perfused, or if it is perfused, there's not a lot of oxygen there. So there's something, definitely a cause for concern. Okay, next up we've seen this, a hematoma, simply a bruise. This just indicates we've had a rupture of blood vessels beneath the skin, indicates we've had some kind of contusion or something like that. Over here on this side, we've got something called pallor. Now, pallor just means paleness. And paleness here means we're not as pink as we should be, right? Normally Caucasians are kind of pink, and everybody should be pink right here, regardless of race or ethnicity. And this pink area in here is called the conjunctiva. And so this is a good area to look at somebody. And if you see the conjunctiva is pale, it could indicate that that person is anemic. They don't have enough red blood cells, and so that would be a cause for concern as well. Okay, another condition over here, this is something called erythema over on the right-hand side. So erythema is redness, and there's different types of erythema. This erythema is called erythema migrans. You don't need to remember that, but it's a migrating rash, and in this case, it's almost diagnostic for a Lyme disease infection. So if you see that happening, you want to worry about it. Unfortunately, Lyme disease is something we don't have to worry about here in Hawaii. Other skin coloration issues. This would be weird, right? This bronzing right here is actually indicative of a certain endocrine system disorder called Addison's disease. And we might talk about that towards the end of the semester. Okay, the last picture here shows something called jaundice. Now, jaundice is a yellowness of the skin, and this is abnormal. Jaundice usually indicates an accumulation of like bilirubin in the bloodstream, and it generally indicates some kind of liver problems. So we see jaundice in people with advanced hepatitis or cirrhosis or something like that. So you see that really yellow coloration, you want to think there might be a liver problem somewhere in there. Okay, we're going back to the epidermis, and we're going to talk about the different layers. Now, the epidermis has up to 5 layers, and remember, the majority of those layers are composed of our keratinocytes, the keratin-producing cells. Okay, the first layer, the bottom layer, is called the stratum basale, and this is this layer right here. The stratum basale, also called the stratum germinativum, is the layer that separates the epidermis from the underlying connective tissue, which is down here. So the stratum basale has that basement membrane right there, and the stratum basale is also the base single layer of cells that are actively dividing. So these cells are dividing very quickly, and as they divide, they're pushing those cells further up into the stratum spinosum, etc. So all the cells that are up here were once time down here somewhere. So that's where the dividing cells are. Okay, the next layer above the stratum basale is called the stratum spinosum, and the stratum spinosum is one of the thicker layers of the skin. It's made up of about 10 cell layers of nice, happy, metabolically active cells. And we call it the spinosum layer because when we pull these cells apart, they have these little spiny appendages that attach them together, but we don't see that in situ. In situ, or in life, we don't actually see these appendages, only when we pull them apart. Okay, above the stratum spinosum is something called the stratum granulosum. Now, granulosum means grainy-like. Okay, this is the stratum granulosum. And within the stratum granulosum, cells are beginning to undergo something called apoptosis. So apoptosis is programmed cell death. We're telling our cells, you must die. And the reason we want them to die is they're going to form an impenetrable layer up here that cannot be infected and very waterproof. So these cells are being programmed to die so that they can go and protect our bodies. And so that's what's going on in the stratum granulosum. As these cells are programmed to die, they're also beginning to accumulate keratohyalin granules, which make them even more waterproof. Okay, finally, the next layer up is not present in all skin, but we do see it in thick skin, and this is called the stratum lucidum. The stratum lucidum, lucid here means clear, is a clear layer. We can't make out any cell boundaries. The cells are really well packed together, and they are dead. Everything above the stratum granulosum is dead. So this is a layer of skin that we only find in the thick skin of the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. And finally, the last layer we have here is something called the stratum corneum. The stratum corneum is the corny layer or hornified layer, cornified, not hornified. The stratum corneum is made up of 25 to 30 cell layers of dead compacted cells. And again, these cells make a really good impenetrable barrier to any bacteria that are trying to get through. The cells are also constantly being shed. So if you ever sit in a dark room and like one window is open and you can see the shaft of light going through there and you see all this like stuff floating around the shaft of light, some of those are skin cells. We're sloughing off millions of skin cells a day, and that's another barrier to infection because if a bacteria gets on there or something, a lot of times that skin cell just sloughs off before that bacteria or virus can get any deeper. Okay, types of skin. I alluded before that there was something called thick skin and thin skin, and there is. Most of your body is covered with thin skin. In fact, the skin is thinnest around your eyelids, gets quite a bit thicker here on your back and your neck, but the thick skin we're talking about is found on your palms and also on the soles of your feet. So in these areas, the skin is different for a couple of reasons. One, it has that stratum lucidum that we talked about, that sort of clear layer in between the corneum and the granulosum. The other thing that we have there is that we don't have any hair follicles in the thick skin. So despite what anybody might say, it is impossible to grow hair on the palms of your hands, and that's a good thing. Okay, so one additional feature that we have in thick skin that we don't have in thin skin are fingerprints, otherwise known as dermatoglyphs. So why do we have fingerprints? Well, if you looked at CSI, they're there to identify us, but that's not why our great creator gave us fingerprints. The reason we have fingerprints and even toe prints is it gives us some traction. The toe prints allow us to walk around barefoot, hopefully without slipping a lot, and then the fingerprints allow us to pick things up and give us a little bit more grip than we would have if we had really smooth skin. Okay, the next layer of the skin is called the dermis. So the dermis is deep or below the epidermis. And the dermis here is composed of connective tissue, and that connective tissue is usually very vascular. There's two different regions of the dermis that we're going to talk about, the reticular layer and the papillary layer. Okay, so let's start out with the papillary layer. So the papillary layer is composed of loose areolar connective tissue. And the word papillae means bump. So you can see these bump-like structures right here in the papillary layer. Now you'll notice that they interdigitate with grooves in the epidermis. And so this helps for a couple of reasons. One, it gives us more surface area so we can transport nutrients between the dermis and the epidermis. Because the dermis here has lots of blood vessels, the epidermis does not. So all the nutrients are coming from the dermis. The other reason this sort of hill-like structure is good is that it gives us more surface area to adhere these two areas of skin together. So it helps to glue the epidermis onto the dermis. Now, if you've ever gotten a blister due to whatever reason you've rubbed against something, you've probably seen it rise up, and the top part of that blister is usually made up of epidermis, and the bottom pink part is the dermis. So in that case, we've torn those two apart, and we've actually had fluid accumulate in between there, and that's what a blister is. Okay, below the papillary layer, we have the reticular layer. The reticular layer is composed of dense, irregular, fibrous connective tissue. So this is a really strong fibrous connective tissue in which the fibers go all different directions. Again, it's very vascular, lots of blood vessels in there. We also have sensory receptors in there that can detect things like deep touch. So here's a histological section of skin. I just want to point some things out while I can. First of all, up top where the red arrow is, this is all epidermis. Right up at the very top there, you can see that flaky layer. That is our stratum corneum. That's the dead layer, or one of the dead layers of the epidermis that's continually flaking away. So red layer up there is epidermis until you get down to about here. So let's follow that up. This is going to be the stratum basale. This is where the first layer of epidermal cells are, and this is where cell division is going on. Above that is our stratum spinosum, nice metabolically active cells. And then we have our stratum granulosum, right? This is where the cells were undergoing apoptosis, or programmed cell death. And then above that, we might have a stratum lucidum if we're in thick skin, and then above that, we have a stratum corneum. Okay, let's look down in the dermis now, right? We said the dermis had two layers, a papillary layer and a reticular layer. So the blue arrow right here is on the dermal papilla. The dermal papilla is composed of areolar connective tissue, and that is a loose fibrous connective tissue. Remember, there's lots of blood vessels in here in the dermis, and especially up here in the in the papillary layer, and that helps to transport nutrients up to the epidermis where it's needed. Finally, down deep in the dermis, we have the reticular layer. The reticular layer is made up of that dense, irregular, fibrous connective tissue with the big, thick fibers that are going every which way. To me, it looks like an abstract painting. So the good thing about dense, irregular, fibrous connective tissue is it's strong no matter what direction you pull it in. Okay, the next layer below the dermis is called the hypodermis. Now, remember, the hypodermis, not technically part of the skin, but we're going to cover that now. So the hypodermis is composed of a little bit of areolar tissue, but a lot of adipose tissue. Adipose tissue was fat tissue. It has a lot of blood and lymphatic vessels as well, and a lot of nerves. And we also have very special touch receptors down there that detect very deep touch or pressure, and these are called Pacinian corpuscles. Now, the interesting thing about the hypodermis is it is attached to the dermis, but it also allows a little bit of movement. So if you ever gave yourself, one of those when you were a kid, that is literally the dermis and epidermis sliding over the hypodermis. The hypodermis allows a little bit of movement and allows the muscles to move without moving the skin directly. Okay, here we can see a thicker section of the skin that includes the hypodermis. So just to review, everything up here to the bottom of the red is epidermis. Everything right here, these are our dermal papilla. They were areolar connective tissue. Now we're down to the reticular dermis, which is dense, irregular, fibrous connective tissue. And now we're down to the hypodermis. Hypodermis is composed of areolar tissue, but mainly it's composed of this adipose tissue. Now this adipose tissue is there for a few reasons. One, it helps to give a little bit of fluidity so the skin can move or the muscles can move without moving the skin, etc. The other thing is it's a lot of insulation, thermal insulation. We don't need so much here in Hawaii. But it's also there is a caloric reserve, right? The fat tissue in here stores about 9 kilocalories per gram, so it's there as a metabolic reserve in times of starvation or whatever. Okay, now we're going to talk briefly about some accessory structures of the skin, and these include things such as hair, oil glands, sweat glands, and nails. Okay, our first accessory structure of skin is hair, and hair is present all over the body except for the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. And it's there for a couple of reasons. The hair on your head does help with thermal regulation. The hair on your arms maybe not so much, but hair also helps us a little bit sensory-wise. Hair is dead now, but if an insect were to land on the hair, let's say on the back of your neck or something like that, you're aware of it because the base of that hair is actually connected to something called a hair root plexus, which is a sensory structure that if that hair shaft moves, the nerve root will then detect that and send information to your brain so you can swat that insect away. So hair consists of two main parts. There's the shaft, which is the part of the hair that's outside the skin, and this is completely dead, so the hair is non-living outside of the skin. Then there's the root of the hair, and that's where we have living cells that are actively keratinizing and producing the hair shaft. So the layers of the hair shaft include the medulla, the cortex, and the cuticle. Starting on the very inside, we have the medulla right here. So this might be a pigmented area, depending on what type of hair you have. And then outside, we have a cortex, the next layer out. And finally, the very outside is called the cuticle here. The cuticle is a single cell layer of compacted dead cells on the outside of the hair. And of course, anybody with hair, longer hair anyway, knows that eventually hair, as it gets older and stuff like that, it starts to split and flake and things like that. And you take these really expensive shampoos that talk about nourishing your hair and giving them the nutrients. Remember, that hair is dead. You're putting grease on the hair. It does make it look better, but the hair doesn't really need nutrients because it's dead. Okay, this is just showing another section of hair. So we can see cross-section, transverse section of the hair going all the way down where we can see the medulla, the cortex, and the cuticle. And remember, the hair shaft itself is non-living. All the hair above the skin is non-living, but the hair root down here is living. This is where we have actively dividing cells, and that hair follicle is surrounded by epithelial tissue, which is producing the hair. Okay, so the word hair follicle. You've heard of hair follicles before. You think you know what they are. So a follicle here is a sac of epithelial tissue that is secreting something. So you've heard of hair follicles, but we're also going to talk about thyroid follicles later on. We're going to talk about ovarian follicles. So don't just assume this word just pertains to hair, because it doesn't. But that hair is being produced by epithelial tissue, and that epithelial tissue is located in a follicle. Okay, now we're going to talk about a few hair-related structures. These are accessory structures associated with hairs. The first of these is something called the erector pili muscle. This is this muscle right there. I can't quite point to it. And the purpose of this muscle is to take the hairs that are laying flat and stand them up on end. Now, why would we want to do that? Well, we can't do it voluntarily. Be pretty cool if we could. But it is there if we're startled or something like that. So if somebody jumps out and they're like, "Rah!" Your hair will actually stand up on end. This happens when you're watching a suspenseful movie or something like that too, and somebody jumps out from behind the shower curtain. It doesn't do us much good because our hair is not very long, but if you look at a cat or something that has longer hair, if they're startled or scared, their hair stands up, and because their hair is very long, it makes them look bigger, and it could potentially ward off a potential predator when they're like, "Oh crap, that cat just got like 20% bigger." But again, it doesn't work for us. Other structures we need to talk about, we already mentioned the hair root plexus. The hair root plexus was a group of nerves that are surrounding the base of the hair follicle, and basically if that hair shaft is moved around, it will detect that vibration, send information to the brain, and tell us that there might be something on our skin we want to wipe off. And finally we have sebaceous glands, which you can see right there, the kind of yellow gland, and the yellow gland is there to produce sebum. Sebum is a sort of waxy, fatty substance, and its purpose is there to lubricate the hair shaft, to keep it nice and good, and also to lubricate and waterproof the skin. Okay, disorders of hair and disorders of the skin. You've heard of something called hirsutism. You're down in Waikiki and you're looking at somebody, you're like, "Why are they wearing a sweater on the beach?" And it's not a sweater, they just have way too much hair. So excessive body hair is called hirsutism. There's different options for that. We can do something like Nair hair removal. You can do various types of treatments such as electrolysis. Probably none of them are very, very pleasant. Okay, then we have our sebaceous glands. We mentioned previously sebaceous glands produce sebum, which is a waxy fatty material that is designed to be extruded through these excrement ducts, and it helps to waterproof the skin and make it look shiny and nice, and it also helps to waterproof the hairs. Now, if we have too much sebum, it can lead to acne, which can be a problem. Okay, so acne is a disorder or inflammation of the sebaceous glands, and it most often occurs around the time of puberty when we're cranking out a lot more sebum, and we're also cranking out a lot more hormones. And so the sebaceous glands become inflamed, even infected with bacteria. We get these red pustules all over the face, and it can be very disfiguring. There's a lot of different treatments for it. You've seen oxy pads, which include benzoyl peroxide, that kind of work. And there's actually some prescription medications like Accutane that work very well, but have some serious side effects. So acne is one of those things that it's like a multi-million-dollar industry because it affects almost everybody at one time or another. And usually you want to go to your dermatologist if you're having serious problems with acne. Okay, our next type of accessory structure in the skin are called sudoriferous glands. And sudoriferous glands is just a fancy word to say sweat glands. So we have two different types of sweat glands, our eccrine sweat glands and our apocrine sweat glands. So eccrine sweat glands are the normal sweat glands. They produce sweat, and the main purpose of the sweat is to cool us and get rid of excess body heat. It also is a way to get rid of a little bit of electrolytes, some urea like I talked about before. But the big thing with eccrine sweat glands is they empty directly onto the surface of the skin. On the other hand, we do have another type of sweat gland called apocrine sweat glands, and these empty into hair shafts right here. So this would be an apocrine sweat gland. And here what it's doing, the secretions are a lot less watery, they're a lot more fatty, and these are the secretions that sort of get invaded by bacteria and very quickly begin fermenting, and they give us that sort of unique body bouquet and odor for those of us that don't like to wear deodorant. Okay, our next accessory structure are nails. Nails are scale-like modifications of the epidermis, and the reason they're there is to protect the distal ends of our digits, also our toes and stuff like that, and so we can chew them. Not really. Okay, so nails are made up of keratin. Keratin is that fibrous, tough protein that we find in hair, also find in skin and the nails as well. And so if you take a look at the anatomy of the nail, right, we have the distal end of the nail, which is way down here. We have the body of the nail, and then finally way up here we have the lunule, or half moon, and then we have something called the cuticle, right? The cuticle is the area from which the nail is arising. So disorders associated with nails that we have is you can have an ingrown toenail. We tend to get these more often if you are clipping your nails too close or if you're wearing shoes that are too tight. Fortunately, here in Hawaii, if you get an ingrown toenail, you just start wearing slippers and eventually it usually goes away, which is pretty cool. All right, now the last part of the lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about how the skin heals when it's torn. Everybody in this class has cut their skin at some point, and they might have cut it shallow or they might have cut it deep. But anyway, skin can heal very well as long as the cut's not too deep or too wide apart. So first of all, we're going to talk about epidermal wound healing. This is basically a paper cut. Have you ever just cut yourself with a paper or something like that, and the cut did not bleed, but it probably hurt like hell, right? That's because the epidermis, even though it's avascular, has lots of nerves in there. So you cut it and you go, ow, that hurts, but you don't see any blood. What's happened here is that you have cut through the epidermis, And now the cells that are going to heal it are going to be these basal cells. These basal cells will migrate to the area where there's no more cells, and then they'll begin dividing upwards to fill in the gap. So eventually we'll go from here to here, where we have begin dividing, and eventually we're going to recreate all those layers that were destroyed in that initial injury. Now, deep wound healing is a little bit different. Deep wound healing involves not just the epidermis, but the dermis and maybe even the hypodermis. So there's 4 different phases here: an inflammatory phase where there's inflammation, there's a migratory phase where those epidermal cells are migrating and also our fibroblasts are moving in. We have a proliferative phase when the connective tissue has already formed a scab, and then we have a maturation phase where the scab actually falls off. Okay, so rather than showing those 4 phases, we're just going to show the beginning and the end. So let's start down here at the beginning. We have the inflammatory phase. So you've stepped on, let's say, I don't know, a nail or something like that, and it's punctured all the way down to your dermis. And what you can see here is that we have lots of white blood cells that are invading that area. We have lots of red blood cells as well, and we're also beginning to form a scab on top, or a blood clot in there to stop the bleeding. Now, over time, what's going to happen? Well, a few different things are going to happen. We're going to have our fibroblasts come in and then start weaving new fibers to bridge the gap of the damaged dermis. And then we're also going to have our epithelial cells move in and start to divide and bridge that gap that was created by the injury. And eventually, we form a complete thickness of epidermis, and that scab that was on top will eventually fall off, and that's called the maturation phase. Now, it's important to point out that epidermal wound healing and deep wound healing can only proceed if the wound isn't too big. Once the wound gets, too wide across, you either need to retract those edges and get stitches, or need to think about a skin graft. Okay, this is the end of our lecture on the integumentary system. As always, if you have any problem parts, go back and review that part of the lecture. And if you have any questions, send me an email or a text. Talk to you later.